Okay, this is the audio review for Chapter 4, Learning Difference, Families, Schools, and Socialization. So socialization is the way that people learn to act and think in accordance with rules and expectations of a particular society. So kids are influenced by a variety of sources, and socialization is an ongoing lifelong process, which often happens without conscious thought or acknowledgement. So in this chapter, we explore how do we learn socialization? How do we become socialized? So it's important to start off by acknowledging that family is the primary agent of socialization. So what this means is they are the first people to tell you what's normal, what's natural, what behaviors, what expectations there are for your kind of behavior, right? So we learn a lot from our parents as to kind of setting up an expectation for us about what the world is like and how we're going to navigate it. So this is the same in regards to race, class, gender, sexuality, all of these different identities that we'll be discussing. We're socialized into the power systems, into the hierarchies that give certain values to certain communities. So as we go through the life course, a lot of these value systems are reinforced for us, and that's why they become internalized to a point where we kind of accept them as our own thoughts and beliefs and not as something that was drilled into us over time. So one of the things we learn is learning gender. So gender is often conflated with biological sex, as we've discussed previously. Many argue that men are predisposed towards certain things, or women are, based on their biological differences. So this dichotomy is the basis of gender logic, yet gender is not static or universal. For example, Margaret Mead, in her studies of cultures in New Guinea, you see such variation into how people go through rites of passage or how they express gender. So gender expectations are put on all of us, are taught to us from birth. Actually, some argue before birth. We'll talk about in a second. But the gender expectations we have in our culture are not normative and natural. They are normative to our culture, but they are not natural in a biological sense, meaning they have to do with our culture, our history, our values, all of those kind of things get put into our understandings of what does it mean to be in a dualistic gender construct, right? What does it mean to be man? What does it mean to be woman? When those are the only two options in a binary. So in other cultures, as we've discussed, third genders are present, right? Or gender expectations are flipped from what we consider normative. So this points out that all of these things are socially learned, right? So gender training is something that's largely unquestioned, and many parents teach gendered values to their children without even realizing it. One example of this is Barry Thorne's research on babies, where they gave research participants a baby in a pink blanket, and everyone said, "Oh, what a sweet baby, coo, 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 she's so cute, she's so beautiful," and treated her very gently. And then they took same baby, wrapped it in a blue blanket, and gave it to participants, and they were like, "Oh, look at him, he's handsome, little slugger," tossing him in the air, shaking him around, being more rough with him, right? So what's interesting is people didn't know the actual biological sex of the baby. They understood the gender dynamics based on the color of the blanket. But it really does demonstrate, her research does, that the way that we then treat people is through this lens of gender. So even a baby, right? And as some further research has shown, even the way that people talk to pregnant women's stomachs while they're pregnant is affected by those kind of socialized gendered expectations. I mean, obviously, we're in the era of gender reveals, which again is a weird thing because it's actually a biological sex reveal, but whatever. So it's a whole nother thing. But it is an interesting time when before a baby's born, you have all the gendered clothes picked out for them, all the gendered nursery items, right? And it's interesting. I have a few friends of mine that they had babies that were female that didn't have full heads of hair. So they would have to somehow clip a bow on them or something of that nature to indicate this is a female gendered child, right? Which again, babies don't give a crap about gender, right? All they do is eat and crap and scream. That's their job. I mean, occasionally they're cute, but mostly it's the throwing up and the screaming and the crapping. So they don't have this sense of gender. We put it on them. We put it on them with what we put on their bodies as far as clothes, the way we talk to them, the kind of expectations we tell them that their life is going to lead. And we'll talk later about how this is reflected in children's toys, right? So there's also a lot of gendered words that we use to refer to boys and girls very differently. Even terms of affection, right, such as sweetie or tiger, that there's a lot more aggression associated with masculinity and a lot more softness, frailty associated with femininity, right? So those things are not biologically inherent, they're learned. So like I said before, gender socialization happens as we age, and if you're playing with toys that convey very different gendered expectations, that's going to set you up for different expectations of the world, right? So let's say if you were dressed in a frilly dress, then you're going to be discouraged from getting dirty, right? Versus little boys' clothes are not as constraining and more open for those kind of activities. It's more normative for a boy to play in the mud. So the toys, though, too, they tend to reflect future roles as adults. So you have the kitchenette set and the baby doll for the little girl. Before the girl can even take care of herself, she's learning how to take care of babies. She's being told that this is her role in the culture, that this is what's important for her. And later we'll talk about the values that we kind of get from this kind of play and why it could be beneficial for every child to have a diversity of that kind of play, to develop different characteristics like compassion, which turns out is not just a female thing. So the toys, again, reflect our future roles. Boys get more sets that are like construction or building, and this affects spatial awareness. This affects what kind of priorities we have, right? So if a boy is never allowed to play with a doll and kind of mimic the roles of adult interactions through that or express compassion, then that's going to affect the way that they turn out as an adult. Just as if little girls can never get dirty, cannot climb trees, cannot build things, then that's obviously going to affect how they then turn out as adults. Also, our parents socialize us through a lot of statements that they think are neutral, but have long-lasting impacts on our gender socialization. Such as, act like a lady, or big boys don't cry, right? As a result of this differential treatment, boys and girls learn to adopt gender as an organizing principle for themselves and for the social world in which they live. So the chapter discusses the intersections, right? The influences of race on gender. So most of the research done on gender socialization reflects a white middle-class norm, which can fail to reflect the actual experiences of many. For example, the book talks about the Latino culture having specific gender socialization features, such as feminismo, the cultural emphasis on family relations, and childbearing as an integral part of femininity, or respecto, this cultural emphasis on respect and hierarchy in social relations. So strong gender role divisions are also normative that contain expectations that women be submissive, chaste, dependent, and that men be dominant, virile, and independent. So what results from these ideologies that are different results in different treatment, right? As parents scrutinize the actions and whereabouts of their daughters more strictly because of the potential for sexual activity, whereas sons do not receive this added scrutiny. Also, when you look at the differences in how African American families socialize children, this has been found in studies that suggest there's more emphasis put on gender equality in roles and expectation, due largely to the historical legacy of women of color contributing financially to the family unit, which is different than the white middle class norm. So it's important to do research on these intersections and not just assume the dominant groups as everybody's experience. So another interesting topic is gender neutrality. So bringing up boys and girls to have both male and female traits and behaviors. And advocates of neutrality argue that there's no biological basis for our social differences. What's interesting is that children in these environments still seem to soak up gender performance, but the effects of these parenting differences are reflected in their ideology in later life, meaning these children are more open and not as stuck to a gender binary. Though by the time they get to school, the education system socialization takes over and does pretty adequately gender them. So there's words that we use like tomboy or sissy, other words that are used to coerce children into expected gender behaviors, seeing them as deviant if they don't. Instead of questioning why we consider something for boys or for girls, we then look at the child as deficient. And this has consequences on their further development. So just as we learn gender identities, we also learn racial identities. Everyone has a racial identity, but different groups assign different degrees of importance to the role of race in their lives. So when it comes to whiteness, few sociologists have attempted to explain how it is that white children come to understand and see themselves as white people. Because as we discussed in white privilege, oftentimes this consciousness, this racial consciousness, if not spelled out, if you are in the hegemonic or most powerful group, you're often unquestioned as the norm. So you often see other people as having racial identities, but not yourself if you are white. So it's interesting how sociologists have tried to conduct research studies to understand how this process works, but much more research has focused on the racial socialization of racial and ethnic minority groups, right? So for children of color, they live in two worlds. One, which is their ethno-racial community, which values them. And then there's the mainstream society that's much more, white supremacist that does not value them. So when discussing the intersections, this is where they talk about the effects of gender and class on racial identities. So the intersection of race, class, and gender is especially apparent during adolescence, when concerns about identity and self-definition may be central features of everyday life. So poor children from oppressed racial or ethnic groups are especially vulnerable to this accumulation of disadvantage, which can influence their psychological well-being over time. So we also learn sexualities. So I think it's important, especially in our culture, to discuss how sex is commercial as well as taboo in the culture. Even though sex is used to sell everything, and the effect of advertising has led to a change in sexual behaviors of youth, so in that way we can see that sex is commercial in our culture, right? Again, used to sell everything. Yet sex is also taboo in the culture, right? Meaning something that we're not supposed to talk about, something that we're supposed to keep to ourselves or keep hidden. So when it comes to education, we are not straightforward about sex like people are in other countries. And of course, this has all sorts of consequences when it comes to, unplanned pregnancies, high STD, STI rates, things of that nature. But really, it comes from this place where people think you can't educate kids about sex because that would be inappropriate. So then we wait until after they've already been interested or already learned about these things from direct experience before we even talk to them about it. So it is an interesting phenomenon that the two sides of the coin in America is that sex is used for every commercial. So the moment that you're a little child, you see hypersexualized people being used in commercials. Yet, if you want to talk about sex, it's taboo. So this is interesting how the direct sexual socialization that happens in other cultures is relatively uncommon in our culture. meaning we learn about these things through conversations, but not necessarily through witnessing, right? Because before the sexual repression of the Victorian era, how did people learn about sex? Well, I mean, gross enough, they learned from seeing it happen, from watching their parents. Again, that's gross to us because of our socialization, but back in the day, if you lived in one big room, it wasn't a situation that you could necessarily avoid, right? So clearly this is not common anymore, but it illustrates how norms change over time. And when we educate children, we tend to tell them what not to do. So the information they learn comes from their peers or from the media. Plus, society is heteronormative, so part of the information that's given is only about heterosexual expression as being appropriate. So our understandings of homosexuality is in constructing the difference between homosexuality and heterosexuality. The term homosexuality was coined in the late 1800s, and our beliefs have changed historically over time when it comes to sexuality. Until the 1970s, the DSM listed homosexuality as a mental disease. People were often subjected to terrible treatments by institutions that saw them as flawed and in need of fixing. So we also need to examine the effect of gender on learning sexuality, because gender differences in the ways that boys and girls are socialized in our society, in that binary, also affects our paths to sexual orientation. So the meanings and connotations of the identities also shape individuals' experiences. So, when it comes to bisexualities, in a society built on duality, the sexual identity of bisexual challenges the dichotomous assumptions, offering a combination or showing the reality of a spectrum of sexual desire. And in modern times, there's new definitions, new groups that have sprung up around new, clearly formed identities, such as people that move beyond the gender binaries. So let's say instead of saying you're bisexual, saying you're pansexual, meaning there are expanding definitions to connect to different expanding identities, right? So as people move past binaries, it no longer makes sense to have limiting definitions, right? So new definitions arise. So again, with pansexual, it's kind of like bisexual, only you're saying that you desire sexual or romantic relationships with either, men, women, or people who are non-binary or trans. So as we kind of change these definitions, and like we talked about, this is how social construction works, right? Things change over time. So they change to reflect the new meanings in the culture, and now, especially right now, there's a lot of new definitions coming into play. Okay, so we also learn our social classes, right? So when we look at theories like conflict theory and structural functionalism or structuralism theory, we see that both theories look at social class as a structural position, right? More so than a part of a personal identity. So both theories argue that class identity provides us with an important lens through which we see the world and our relative position in it. Though, of course, conflict theory and functionalism differ greatly as to their interpretations of the social hierarchy of class, as we'll discuss. So, when it comes to social class and socialization, some families have greater access to economic resources that are associated with a comfortable childhood, right? Lots of toys, athletic equipment, a nice house, access to good schools, parental support for appropriate activities. Children who are raised in these environments benefit from the material advantages. In contrast, those who live in unstable or substandard housing or in unsafe neighborhoods whose parents work long hours but still can't afford amenities of a healthy life really face special burdens in terms of physical needs, but also in their identities. So when it comes to different social class positions, this does affect parenting values and parenting approaches. So social class shapes our experiences and our perceptions of the world. So it affects parents' values that they pass on to their children. Social class differences in socialization have important implications for children's futures. Poor kids are taught to obey authority because their future relies upon employment, while middle-class children and wealthy children are taught to be more assertive and end up feeling more in control of their own futures. So self-entitlement really works in the same way, as we'll later discuss. So in the chapter, they also look at the intersection of class, race, and motherhood. So according to Patricia Hill Collins, socioeconomic status has long worked in tandem with a history of racial domination and gender inequality to shape the socialization of children. Middle-class mothers have more time and more resources, so they can devote more of their, time and energy that they have free to mothering those emotional needs of their children. But for poor mothers, especially if they're facing compounding marginalities, if it's not just their social class, if it's also their race, then, poor mothers of color, their child rearing is going to revolve around different themes. The three that she discusses are physical survival, which is that poor children of color face heightened rates of infant mortality and poverty. So living in poor neighborhoods increases interactions with drugs, crime, industrial pollutants, and violence, which pose daily risks and, of course, long-term health consequences. Another of those three different themes, the second, is power. Poor mothers of color often feel powerless to control their own lives. They face the burden of disillusionment and hopelessness that comes from contact with dominant cultural, economic, educational, and political institutions that marginalize them, that silence them. And the third theme is identity. That mothers fight to foster a meaningful racial identity for their children within a society that tends to malign people of color, and to teach their children how to survive in a system that's not structured to provide them with long-term advantages. So we learn and we're socialized at home from our primary agent of socialization, but then we enter schooling. And education becomes a very important system and agent of socialization for us. So after our parents or our family, school is the next group that then gets to influence our young minds. And of course, for many years. So the reason that school exists is to socialize people, to prepare them to be functional adults in society. So once the system itself of education has socialized us, we're also then socialized by our peers. And once they become our main influence, they then remain that for the rest of our lives. Our friends, our classmates, they provide us with extensive information about our social identities. Once you hit adolescence, the influence of your peers becomes more important than family influence. Peer groups reinforce the lessons about social identity that are learned at home, that are learned at school, in part because the neighborhoods and schools tend to be relatively uniform in social class and in ethno-racial makeup because we live in a very segregated society. When it comes to gender lessons, educational institutions are key locations for learning and doing gender. Schools at all levels contain subtle and not so subtle lessons about what's considered appropriate and inappropriate behavior for female and male members of society. For instance, girls receive less teacher attention and less useful feedback than boys do. Girls talk significantly less in class than boys do. And girls rarely see mention of the contributions of women in their textbooks. Girls are also more likely than boys to be the focus of unwanted sexual attention. So this obviously structures the experience of education differently. And the consequences are not harmless, right? Such as stereotypes that men are intrinsically better at math, which then frame women's opportunities within STEM fields, within certain career paths, right? So also, school is big on segregating the sexes because boys and girls tend to have different experiences in school. So segregating them by gender tends to work for the benefit of girls when you talk about, boys' schools, girls' schools, things like that, showing that girls who go to an all-girls school are more assertive, they're more confident, and they're more likely to go into male-dominated fields of engineering or math. So you can kind of see what happens when you don't have the influence of that sexism in the classroom in the same kind of way. Another intersection they mention is gender, race, and bullying, right? Girls are assumed to be less aggressive, but girls who live in poor neighborhoods are just as likely to wield violence as their male counterparts. Female bullying tends to focus on relationships, not to cause pain, but to humiliate a person socially. But those things have variations depending on your intersecting identities and what you've learned as how to basically react to aggression or to bullying. Masculinities through coaching is another huge one. A lot of research has focused on, the socialization of men in sports cultures, things of that nature. So, some research has looked at how girls are gender socialized in these institutions as well. But finally, in general, research is starting to look at men and the gendered lessons that boys learn and how those lessons have lasting impacts into their adult identities, especially when so much around coaching is a lot of policing of gender and policing of sexuality, meaning, walk it off, be a man. There's a lot of homophobic slurs and a lot of sexist slurs that we use to kind of police men back into what's considered an appropriate gender expression, especially in high school. So also, when moving on to class and race lessons, in public schools, poor children are subtly taught that their place is lower in the hierarchy, right? Through those authority relationships that they have with teachers and their principals, so that they'll be prepared for the subordinate work positions that they'll probably occupy in the future. So the structure of education does reify inequality, though a lot of people point to it as a way to end inequality. In a lot of ways, education reinforces inequality. We assume that school racial segregation is a thing of the past, but due to racial segregation of neighborhoods, that also, of course, determine where students go to school, it's actually still a very common issue today. So just to conclude briefly, the essence of who we are, our gender, our racial and class identity, our sexuality, is not private property. All of us in one way or another are a reflection of a cultural value system, of historical processes and other attitudes and expectations of people in our lives that we then mirror in our own behaviors.